With the recent death of Pope Francis, the world paused to remember a spiritual leader without an army, guiding his flock through words, not weapons. And today the idea of a papal army sounds almost absurd, an oxymoron. And yet, in the 19th century, there was a papal army. And in 1867 it claimed its last real battlefield victory. And in that forgotten chapter of history, a small band of Englishmen, subjects of Queen Victoria, laid aside crown and country to fight for the Pope. This is the story of the Papal Zouaves and the forgotten Englishmen, Scotsmen and Irishmen who marched beneath the cross and keys for Pope Pius IX. Pope Pius IX was caught in the storm of the Italian Risorgimento, the movement to unify Italy from a series of diverse kingdoms, republics and foreign empires into a single nation. By the mid-19th century, led by the powerful King of Sardinia Piedmont, Victor Emmanuel II, as well as revolutionaries such as Giuseppe Garibaldi and his Red Shirts, opponents across the peninsula had been swept aside. In 1861, Italy was declared a united kingdom under Victor Emmanuel II, and Rome declared the capital. There was only one small problem. Rome was still under the control of the Pope. For over 1,000 years, the papacy was not just a spiritual authority, but a temporal power too, a sovereign ruler over significant swathes of land across central Italy. The Papal States were an enduring symbol of the Pope's independence, shielding the Church from kings and emperors alike. To Catholics throughout Europe, to lose them was to risk reducing the papacy to just yet another voice in a secular world. But to Italian nationalists like Garibaldi, the Pope's temporal power was an anachronism, a relic of the medieval past, standing in the way of modern nationhood. By 1861, following a series of wars, the Papal States had shrunk to just the Lazio region surrounding Rome, propped up by a French garrison, courtesy of Emperor Napoleon III, Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. But under a deal struck with Italy, the French agreed to withdraw by the end of 1866. Pope Pius IX needed a new army. And fast. Enter the Papal Zouaves, Catholic volunteers from across Europe and beyond. Their uniform, modelled after the dashing French Zouave regiments who'd fought in Algeria and the Crimean War, featured baggy trousers, short jackets and bright sashes. Established in 1861 under the command of a colonel from the Pope's Swiss Guard, by 1868 the Zouave had grown into a 4-battalion regiment, nearly 4,600 strong. The largest groups came from the Netherlands, France and Belgium, but among them were also just over 300 British and Irish volunteers. In Protestant Britain, the Risorgimento was generally popular. Some Britons even travelled to Italy to join Garibaldi's Red Shirts. But within the Catholic community, sentiment was different. For them, the Pope's temporal power, his earthly rule, was seen as essential to safeguarding his spiritual authority. For these Catholics, volunteering to fight for the Pope became a noble cause, often referred to as the Ninth Crusade. Most were driven by religious devotion, others by a hatred of liberalism, a few even sought martyrdom. And maybe, just maybe, some were simply drawn by the lure of travel and adventure. Whatever their reason, each volunteer did need a letter of recommendation from a priest or a bishop. But how could subjects of Queen Victoria serve in the Pope's army? Well, in theory they couldn't. The Foreign Enlistment Act of 1819 made it illegal for British subjects to join a foreign army. But of course, it was only effective if it was enforced. Almost from the enactment of that law, there had been a steady stream of British volunteers going off to fight in other nations' armies, starting with the Independence Wars in South America, then the Carlist civil wars in Spain, and even the Italian Risorgimento itself. Back in 1860, about 800 English and Scots had travelled to Italy to join Garibaldi's army in its fight with the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Claiming that they were going as tourists to look at Mount Etna, yes, all 800 of them, the British authorities turned a blind eye. And they did so once again, as British Catholics headed off to Italy to fight on the other side. The English Zouaves were a curious mixture. Some came from ancient Catholic aristocratic families, like the Vavasours of Hazelwood Castle in Yorkshire, whose roots reached all the way back to the Norman conquest. Meanwhile, from Scotland, Charles Menzies Gordon hailed from a long line of Catholic and Jacobite supporters. Indeed, his great-grandfather, John Gordon, had commanded the bodyguards that escorted Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, from the battlefield of Culloden. A few even had military experience. Arthur Staunton, for instance, had served as an officer in the 20th East Devonshire Regiment and also the 78th Highlanders. Others, such as John O'Donnell, had experience serving in various volunteer and militia battalions, in his case the 64th Lancashire Rifle Volunteers, the Liverpool Irish. The majority of the British Zouaves, however, came from the middle and working classes. John Hindle Lloyd, one of the few Welsh Zouaves, had originally been a clergyman in the Church of England. After his conversion to Catholicism in the 1840s, he embraced the papal cause with passion, despite being over 50 years old when he volunteered to fight for the Pope. With this mixed composition, from castles to mills, the British contingent in the Papal Zouaves was actually a lot more socially diverse in rank and file than any similar regiments in the contemporary British regular army. Life in Rome for the Zouaves was not one constant battle. In fact, for 6 long years, they endured the tedious monotony of garrison duty, with only occasional excitement like helping during a cholera outbreak in Rome. Still, they built a community. At Piazza della Valle in Rome, the British Zouaves established a club, complete with library, billiard room, dining rooms, and a chapel. They even organised cricket matches. In 1868, an all-English Zouave team played against an all-England in Rome side. The Zouave captain, Frederick Wellman, would later play as wicket-keeper for Middlesex, Somerset and Surrey. It won't surprise English cricket fans to learn that the match was abandoned due to rain. Many of the English Zouaves also attended the English Roman Catholic College in Rome, where services were held in their mother tongue. But beneath the camaraderie, tensions simmered. Many Irish Zouaves, drawn from the working class communities of Glasgow, felt little kinship with their English counterparts. To them, the Catholic English was simply English, with the same anti-Irish prejudices as Protestants back in the old country. They set up their own rival club. But it wasn't just the English Catholics that the Irish fell out with. The papal authorities, the very people that the Irish were fighting for, were suspicious of at least some of their loyalties, because many Irish recruits sympathised with the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Fenians. Their radical politics seemed to many in the Papal States rather too close to the revolutionary ideas espoused by their enemy Garibaldi and his Red Shirts. And when the Irish Zouaves attended a meeting commemorating the Manchester martyrs, Fenians hanged back in England, the papal authorities, alarmed, confined them to barracks. Some were then sent home, others then left in protest. Finally, in October 1867, the storm broke. Garibaldi's Red Shirts, with the tacit support of the Italian kingdom, invaded Lazio, aiming to capture Rome. A small contingent even made a daring raid into Rome itself to coincide with a popular uprising in the city. 2 revolutionaries detonated a mine under the Zouaves barracks on the 22nd of October, killing 23 Zouaves and 4 civilians. But despite that carnage, the planned uprising was swiftly put down by the papal army. Meanwhile, the French had landed troops at the port city of Civitavecchia and joined forces with the papal army under the command of General Hermann Kanzler. Kanzler, from Baden in Germany, had served in the papal forces since 1845 and now had a combined army consisting of 5,000 men to take on Garibaldi's Red Shirts. And if you're thinking that a papal army sounds like an anachronism from the Middle Ages, think again. Whilst numerically small compared to the armies of Italy, it was armed with modern weapons and consisted of artillery, cavalry and infantry, including the Zouaves. You might be surprised to know that the papal army was also the 3rd army in Europe to adopt a rudimentary version of the machine gun. On the 3rd of November 1867, near the town of Mentana to the northeast of Rome, the papal and French forces faced Garibaldi's army. The fighting was brutal, and the Zouaves, including those British Catholics, were in the thick of it. Zouaves wielding bayonets and sabres clashed with Garibaldi's red shirts in the vineyards and olive groves. Smoke from the musket fire curled through the trees as cries of "Viva il Papare! Long live the Pope King!" echoed across the field. Despite being outnumbered, the papal and French forces routed the red shirts. The Battle of Mentana was the last time in a history stretching back nearly 1,000 years that an army fighting directly for a pope would win a military battle. Garibaldi's army lost over 1,100 men killed and wounded, and a further 1,000 captured. Papal losses, on the other hand, were 144 killed and wounded, along with just 38 French casualties. Those French figures reflect that they were only thrown into the battle in the latter stages. The reality, as reflected by the casualty figures, was that Garibaldi's red shirts were defeated not by superior French firepower, but by repeated bayonet charges by the Papal Zouave. 24 of the 30 men killed from the Papal army were Zouave. Among their dead were 2 young Englishmen, Alfred Collingridge, aged 21, and Julian Watts-Russell, aged just 17, the youngest Zouave to die at Mentana. Julian hailed from a wealthy Catholic family in Staffordshire and had studied at the Catholic College of St Cuthbert's near Durham. Fired by youthful zeal, he volunteered for the Papal army as soon as he was able to. After his death at Mentana, Julian's body lay in state near Santa Maria Maggiore, the church where Pope Francis was recently buried. His sacrifice was mourned deeply by English Catholics, and he was regarded by many as a martyr. His elder brother, Wilfred Watts-Russell, who was also serving as a Zouave, survived the battle and was awarded the Mentana Medal by Pope Pius IX. The medal was a silver decoration given to those who had fought at the battle, and for English Catholics it was a rare and treasured honour, visible proof that their loyalty had been recognised by the Vicar of Christ himself. To many of them, it symbolised more than military service. It represented a badge of faith and devotion. The deaths of Julian and others spurred a wave of new English enlistments. The new recruits' travel costs to Rome were covered by a papal defence committee established by prominent British Catholics, including the future Home Secretary Henry Matthews. Matthews' role in both the Papal Defence Committee and as Home Secretary are pretty much forgotten. However, his time in office was eventful. He was the Home Secretary during the bloody riots in Trafalgar Square in London in 1888, and later that same year during the Jack the Ripper case. But history was against the Catholic volunteers. In 1870, disaster struck. The Franco-Prussian War erupted, and the French garrison protecting Rome was recalled. By September, Napoleon III had surrendered to the Prussians at Sedan. The Pope was on his own, and it didn't take long for King Victor Emmanuel II of Italy to strike. Within just a week, he sent an envoy to meet the Pope, offering a face-saving proposal that agreed to the entry of the Italian army into Rome. The meeting on the 10th of September was a disaster, with Pope Pius accusing the Italians of treachery and wanting in faith, and announced that the Italians would never enter Rome. The following day, Italian forces invaded the Papal States. By the 19th of September, the Italian army had reached the Aurelian walls surrounding the inner historic city of Rome, and the following morning, an artillery bombardment commenced. The Papal forces defending the city amounted to roughly 15,000 men, whereas the invading Italians, under General Raffaele Cadorna, were over 3 times their size. When the Aurelian Wall finally gave way at Porta Pia, Zouaves and the Papal infantry desperately tried to plug the gap with frantic volleys of rifle fire, but it was a hopeless defence. Italian troops poured into the city. Shortly after 9 a.m, a white flag was hoisted over the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Rome had fallen. The defeated papal troops were escorted by the Italians into St. Peter's Square. Welshman William Jacob wrote, "I thought of my countryman, Caractacus, who was the leader of the Britons during the Roman conquest, and consoled myself with the reflection that I was not the first Welshman led through Rome as a captive." Across Protestant Britain, many newspapers celebrated the fall of Rome as a triumph for liberty and modernity. But within Catholic circles, there was deep mourning. Masses were held to pray for the Pope. Sermons spoke of loyalty to a temporal power that was no more. And for Catholic families who had sent their sons to Rome, it felt like the end of an era and the fading of a dream. The Papal army, apart from the Swiss Guard, was disbanded. Rome was incorporated into and became the capital of Italy. Pope Pius continued to exercise his claims to the wider Papal States and announced that he was a prisoner in the Vatican. Relationships between the Holy See and the Italian state would not normalise until the 1920s. Today, the Vatican City is recognised as an independent city-state, encircled by Rome. The Zouaves returned home and largely disappeared from history. Some faded into obscurity, others fought again in both the Franco-Prussian War and in the Carlist Wars in Spain. General Hermann Kanzler remained in Rome, refusing a pension from the Italian government, and died in 1888. He was buried at the cemetery at Verano, where many of his Zouaves had been laid to rest. Scotsman Charles Menzies Gordon was ordained into the Catholic priesthood, serving in Jamaica and ultimately becoming a bishop. He died in Roehampton, England in 1911, aged 80. John Hindle Lloyd, the former Church of England priest, returned to Britain, where he died on the Isle of Wight in 1887. Wilfrid Watts-Russell, the brother of the martyred Julian, also returned to Britain. He died in London 9 years later, in 1879. The Papal Zouaves fought for a cause already slipping into history. Faith, loyalty, tradition, values worth dying for, they believed, even as the world moved on. And among them, the small band of British volunteers held a special place. Subjects of the Queen, but soldiers of the Pope. Forgotten by their countrymen, they stood at the crumbling gates of an ancient world. One former English Zouave later wrote simply, "We fought for the Holy Father, and if we failed, it was not for want of faith, nor for lack of courage." A forgotten tale of Victorian Britons who fought for their faith rather than for an empire. Well, I hope you enjoyed that little piece of forgotten military and British history. Plenty more stories in the pipeline, including the British expedition to Abyssinia, Ethiopia in the 1860s, a daring raid by the Royal Navy on the Bolshevik Russian fleet in 1919, and a disastrous troop train inferno during World War I that still stands as Britain's worst ever railway disaster. In the meantime, thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I hope to see you again very soon.